Hey, what's going on, guys? So today I'm going to talk to you guys about my soil test from last year and how it compared to my soil test this year. As you guys know, or if you don't know, I had a really high soil pH when I first moved into this house last year. And that was one of the main things I focused on correcting over last season. I'll go ahead and throw that soil test up now. And as you can see, there's a fair amount of deficiencies across the board with macro and micronutrients. But my main focus for the season was trying to bring down my soil pH while also just working on some of the deficiencies elsewhere. But the main goal was correcting the pH starting last year. So I don't know a whole lot about lawn care. I'm just kind of learning as I go, and I learned from a lot of people, professionals. And I didn't know where to go with this, so I reached out to quite a few professionals in the lawn care YouTube world, just did research, and specifically I reached out to Matt Martin from the Grass Factor to help me put together a plan for beginning to correct my soil pH. And I have him here today on the video. So how you doing, Matt?
I'm good, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to have you here and kind of talk to you guys, talk to my audience about what all I did and how that helped correct the soil pH and just kind of started that whole process. And because I know you can explain it far better than I ever could. But I'm going to kind of talk a little bit initially just about what you recommended, what I did, and then we'll just kind of build from there. So I just wanted to say to the audience first is this video is not intended to be something to say, hey, you need to do exactly what I did to correct your soil pH. I would always recommend taking your soil test to professionals to have them put together a guide or recommendations based on your specific soil test, because everybody's soil is a little bit different, and you can't just take things as a oh, he did it, so I can do it the same way. It just doesn't work that way. Would you agree with that, Matt?
Yeah, there's so much variability that takes place, even though you may be geographically located in a similar place, the amount of variability that can occur from property to property is pretty extreme. And so it's best to operate under the standpoint that, one, you aggregate as much data as you possibly can and then build your plan based off the data that pertains specifically to your situation. Ultimately, data is king, and so the more you can collect, the more precise you can be in your execution, and therefore the faster and more predictable you can elicit a response.
So I'll go ahead and throw up this year's soil test, and you can see there's a drastic improvement in my soil pH, and all the deficiencies with the macro and micronutrients have also improved as well. So I'm just going to dive into what Matt recommended, specifically the materials first, and then I'll go into the actual application rates and when I applied everything. So the materials that he told me to use was elemental sulfur, citric acid, and then predominantly for my nitrogen source for fertilizing was going to be coming from ammonium sulfate. All of these three things, from what I understand, help correct soil pH to some degree. So what I did was I went down with 4 applications of elemental sulfur. All of them were spread about 30 days apart or so, and they were all at 5 pounds per 1,000. Did my first app in May, went July, August, and September. And then citric acid, I did 1 pound per 1,000, 30 days apart between those as well. Those started in July. I went July, August, September, and the last one was in October. And then I started with my ammonium sulfate applications during the summer, very low applications, very low inputs of nitrogen. And then I kind of spoon-fed more frequently with ammonium sulfate throughout fall, since that is more of a primary growing season for cool season lawns. So that's what I did based off the recommendations that Matt gave me. Matt, my first question to you, going further into beginning explaining things, is why did you recommend, I guess, going with a higher annual rate of elemental sulfur for my situation Because from what I understand, 10 pounds per thousand for the annual year is generally the rule of thumb. Is that correct, or am I wrong in that?
No, you're right. That it generally is. And the reason why is because it's not something I would typically recommend across the board. But from my standpoint, if I'm talking to someone and they have the wherewithal to pay keen attention to their property day in and day out, and they can make adjustments on the fly, whether that be more water or whatever the case, then sometimes you kind of push the boundaries of what's considered the status quo, right? And so it's increasing the level of risk there. However, I felt totally confident that, you would be able to keep eyes on it. And in the event you do need to increase your watering rate, you'll be there and recognize that and go ahead and make those changes.
Based on my soil type, it being very high clay, high CEC, did that also play a factor in your decision as well?
Yeah, no doubt about it. And so let's also make the statement too that you had such a high soil pH that typically when you're dealing with a soil pH as high as yours was, it's elemental sulfur at 2 applications alone isn't really going to be enough acidifying material to move the needle all that much, right? And so I knew that if there was going to be any kind of major corrective action that needed to take place, it was going to have to be done very aggressively, especially since the majority of the high pH that you were running into is likely a direct result of your watering, right, or coming from your municipal water system. And so with that being already a counteractive standpoint to what you're working with, I felt it to be totally necessary to go ahead and push that envelope. It's not something I would recommend across the board, but ultimately it comes down to the competency of the person making the applications, and you fit the bill to be able to handle that.
And in regards to like the citric acid, from what I understand with the citric acid, it essentially kind of, elemental sulfur doesn't, because that's essentially broken down by the microorganisms in the soil. From what I understand, it oxidizes the elemental sulfur. And from what I understood, the microorganisms don't necessarily work or function as well in a high soil pH environment. So the citric acid can kind of temporarily lower it in a fashion to help that reaction, I guess, occur a little bit better or more efficiently. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, in effect, with anything we apply, there's going to be a temporary, and I want to stress that, an extremely temporary negative effect on soil microbes. But in terms of citric acid specifically, remember, citric acid is one of the acids emitted by the root system, by root exudates, right? So it's probably the safest option. It's going to be the least toxic and least dangerous to even handle as a human, right? You could go out with something like phosphoric acid as well. However, phosphoric acid is extremely corrosive, and if you it can burn your skin pretty good. It's not something that just anybody should handle. So the idea there is using citric acid to work immediately towards dissolving a lot of your carbonates. And in a high pH soil, typically you have excess calcium carbonates and excess magnesium carbonates. And a little bit of a hint, where do you normally see calcium carbonate and magnesium carbonate? You normally see it in lime, right? So naturally, your soil has accumulated a high amount of lime, and that's whether just due to your soil composition or, again, carbonates being fed into your soil via your irrigation system. But applying citric acid to that, or either a weak or strong acid to that, in effect, what ends up happening is those carbonates will react with that acid and form a soluble form of it known as a citrate. So all of a sudden your calcium carbonate and your magnesium carbonate becomes calcium citrate and magnesium citrate, which is soluble. Therefore, it can move with water. And so in the event as you water or as you receive rainfall, you're actually leaching out that magnesium citrate and that calcium citrate out of your upper soil profile, which is going to start to move the needle on your soil pH downward because you're losing the concentration of carbonates because they've been reacted and have flushed out. And in that same event, as that does start to decrease, you're going to get the increase in microbial activity, which is going to help assist with the elemental sulfur becoming sulfuric acid and continuing that process.
And I know, there's always a number of variables that come into play when we're doing anything to our lawn. But I know two of the other things that help with elemental sulfur being broken down is moisture in the soil, as well as heat, the soil being heated by the sun and all those types of things. Is that correct as well?
Yeah, so think of it as like an organic fertilizer, right? And how do you facilitate the release of an organic fertilizer? Adequate soil temperature, adequate soil moisture. That's kind of the name of the game to facilitate breakdown of anything. It's like, think about a compost pile, right? What temperature does that like to be at? That's going to be somewhere between 130 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and you have to keep it wet, and it likes to be warm. That natural breakdown is going to be a warm process. So the exact same thing when you're talking about microbial degradation into another product like that, then again, warm soil, adequate soil moisture is going to give you the fastest release time of that type of product.
So we've talked about elemental sulfur and citric acid. How does ammonium sulfate fit into the puzzle as far as helping begin lowering that soil pH?
Yeah, so ammonium sulfate, when applied to the soil and goes into solution, ammonium is going to convert over. And as it does convert towards nitrates, you're actually releasing hydrogen ions into the soil, and the hydrogen ions in the soil is what has the acidifying effect. Remember, soils with hydrogen or acidic soils, right? So that is number one. Even though it is a secondary effect of using that fertilizer, if you can kill two birds with one stone, that would work better for you in the long term. Then also the second piece of it is that urea as a nitrogen source tends to volatilize at a higher rate in high pH soils. So meaning more of the nitrogen you apply is lost either atmospherically or through leaching. But in this instance, typically it's atmospherically. So you get a bigger bang for your buck on multiple fronts using ammonium sulfate than you would urea as a nitrogen source.
So out of all those materials, if somebody can't get their hands on citric acid or ammonium sulfate, what is the heavy lifter? What's the product or material they would probably need most of in order to actually get some long-term effects with bringing down their soil pH?
Well, here's kind of the risky thing about that. When you have a soil pH over 8, elemental sulfur is simply not really going to be enough to move the needle a whole lot. And so that's where the reliance on the combination of citric acid and elemental sulfur coming together to be able to create that initial flush and allow things to begin to start moving downward at a relatively accelerated rate. It's not going to happen super fast. It's not happening over a month, but over the course of a season, you can actually make some real progress in that regard. So it's difficult for me to say that one is more of a heavy lifter than the other because in reality, they kind of rely on each other to have that synergistic effect to achieve the type of result you're looking for.
All right. Well, that's good to know because I was kind of under the impression that, you needed elemental sulfur more so than, citric acid or ammonium sulfate or something like that. So I'm glad you were able to steer me in a better direction or educate me about that, because that was kind of my understanding with everything. So Matt, I know generally when you're starting to lower soil pH, seeing 0.5 of a point drop in soil pH is not generally what people are going to see when they start doing that. this isn't normal, right? Would you say this is kind of an outlier of what you would generally see when somebody begins to work on this type of thing in their soil?
Yeah, 100%. It's not normal, and that's a testament to the keen eye, the thought, and the execution plan you put into this in order for that to happen. No, that is not a common occurrence.
What's a general timeline for people to expect when starting to work on lowering their soil pH?
If depending on how aggressive you are, you could, I would say 0.1 to 0.2 per season is kind of your status quo if you continue to stick with it in an aggressive fashion. Just very seldom do you see things move at 0.5. And again, it requires the type of regimented plan you executed to even have a shot at moving it at that rate.
So moving forward into this year, knowing that I, did a pretty heavy application of elemental sulfur last year, and knowing that there is some residual effects that is still kind of working in the soil, essentially, because I know applications of elemental sulfur can kind of take months, 3 to 5 months. I don't know if that's the general timeline of it actually being able to break down, but I know that there's probably still some of it kind of working. It's, doing whatever it needs to do in the soil. So this year I thought maybe I should go not nearly as aggressive, maybe do 1 or 2 applications of elemental sulfur here in the spring, and then maybe again late summer, but then continue my monthly applications of citric acid, since I know from what you have told me that there is no residual effects with the citric acid. It is kind of a short-term gain that you get from that. And then continuing my getting my nitrogen source from ammonium sulfate. Does that sound like, a good approach for this year after going pretty aggressive last year?
100%. In fact, just running citric acid alone would be enough to likely maintain you where you currently are. And so that little bit of bump from continuing with the what I would call a long-term approach of the elemental sulfur is just a nice, relatively mild continuation of what you did last year, scaled down a bit because you did move the needle so much, and safe way to go about that.
So the other thing I was planning on doing this year that isn't necessarily related directly to the pH was, as far as my macronutrients, I know I could still, utilize some potassium in the soil. So for the year, I was planning on getting between 2 to 3 pounds of potassium down in the lawn, just to help during any stressful times, and I know it does a lot more than just help stress recovery and those types of things. So that's another plan I had. How does that sound for you?
Yeah, so the two most underutilized nutrients in any turf setting right now are phosphorus and potassium. And of those two, I would say potassium is the absolute least utilized. It plays so many roles in so many different physiological functions within the plant, and oftentimes it's not looked at as a pivotal piece because potassium alone does not elicit a color response. Potassium alone, you don't see a lot of sexy technology as it relates to potassium, right? There's no D-potassium inhibitor, urease, nitrification. None of that stuff exists around potassium. And so, therefore, it's oftentimes discarded. You see all the technology related to nitrogen, and now you're starting to see more of it related to phosphorus. But everybody kind of leaves potassium off the boat. And unfortunately, with it playing such critical roles, that a lot of times, a lot of issues that can be solved are just by plugging potassium into a program. So, in my opinion, at least what I know of your property and what I know of your area and what I know of looking at the, like the PACE Turf Climate Appraisal Form, 2 to 3 pounds of potassium sounds absolutely adequate. And I think that is a surefire way to help achieve as much success as you possibly can.
So it was just really cool last year to see I was starting to see the results just in how the lawn was looking. I know I reached out to you at one point saying, Matt, the lawn is like a super dark green. It's the greenest it's ever been. I haven't put a lick of nitrogen or iron down on the lawn. Um, why is this happening? And even this year, this point in time this year compared to this point in time last year, the lawn is it's just, I can't describe the green. It's just like the truest green like I've seen in a lawn. It doesn't have that like really deep, dark iron green. But it definitely is just a very, pure green that I see in the lawn. I saw it last year as I started to do this, and I'm seeing it again this year. And then it's cool to see it from that perspective, and cool to see those results on the soil test itself, just to see, the hard work, starting to pay off, and you're seeing those improvements. But I wanted to kind of ask you, Matt, too, why was it that I was seeing and still do see that unique color in the lawn?
Yeah, and it's because if you look at a pH nutrient availability chart, as you move the needle closer to neutral, you have increased availability of all your nutrients pretty much across the board. And so a lot of times you'll hear the phrase unlocking nutrients, and there's some validity to that, but the best way to go about quote unquote unlocking things is really just making them plant available. And how do you do that? Using something like, for instance, elemental sulfur, which converts into sulfuric acid, or using citric acid, which is also an effective chelator. So if you took ferric oxide with ferrous citrate, with citric acid, then that becomes ferrous citrate, which is a chelated form of iron, and therefore that is plant available. And so all of a sudden, all these things that your turf hasn't had access to, it now has access to. Even though you're not applying it, it already existed in your soil, but the plant can now tap into it, and so you're seeing things starting to operate optimally. And that's why you have that type of what I would consider peak or sustainable performance out of your grass that you may not have seen prior to.
I mean, that makes sense, because that's I know it can work on that on both spectrums, whether it's high or low. You're kind of, the grass or plant can't uptake the nutrients that may be actually in the soil. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, Matt, I want to thank you for taking the time to help me talk about this topic in my soil test, because I was just blown away by the results, and I didn't want to butcher the explanation behind everything, and I didn't want to come off as someone trying to tell people this is what you need to do, because I am by no means an expert, just a DIYer that just loves taking care of their lawn way too much. So I really do appreciate you coming on and talking to me and my audience about all this. And I hope everybody enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something. If you did, don't hit the like button, subscribe, all that fun jazz. And Matt, do you have any parting words?
No, just thanks for being here, Ben.
All right, guys, thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you in the next video.